Psychedelics of Future Past talk show, where we trip to your favorite times and places to learn more about the history of psychedelics. That's right, we are your hosts today. I am Fungi Silo, and this is Molly, or Sally, depending upon how ecstatic or empathetic she's feeling.
Yes, and right now I'm so excited for our trippy topic, set and setting in psychedelic experiences. What are set and setting, you might ask? Well, today we'll explore just that and more with our guests.
Or, as we like to call them, psychedelics.
From three domains: the classical psychedelic movement domain, the indigenous psychedelic practices domain, and the therapeutic psychedelic research domain.
Now, some of you might not know yet, but those different domains are more connected than you think. And not just because they focus on the psychedelic experience. So get ready, get set, and settings.
I am really excited for our first psychedelic because she comes from the classical period of mainstream psychedelics. In the era of thought leaders like Leary, Metzner, Alfred, Hoffman, I could go on. It's the era of mind-expanding experiences, questioning authority, resistance to the machine, groovy music, free love. What a time. But more importantly, the era where set and setting are introduced to Western research and culture.
May I do the honor of transcending her? Turn on, tune in, and drop out.
T, hi.
Hey, what's going on?
It's great to have you back on the show.
It's great to be back, and I'm really excited for today's episode on set and setting.
Yeah, you have no idea how much we got to learn, and so let's get to it. First, let's begin with describing what both set and setting means for a psychedelic experience.
Yeah, of course. Well, set and setting are basically all the things we consider before, during, and after a psychedelic experience. The set involves the preparation, and the setting involves the physical environment.
Okay, so like this would be our setting.
Mm-hmm.
All right. So how is this concept of set and setting introduced into modern research? I mean, you are wise in this first wave of psychedelic explorations. So tell me.
Yeah, well, I'm sure you're both familiar, and probably many of you are familiar with Dr. Timothy Leary.
Indeed.
He is a well-known psychedelic advocate and researcher from Harvard University, and he challenged the social and societal and scientific boundaries of psychedelic drug use. He first used the term set and setting in a paper that he presented at the annual meeting of the American Psychological Association back in 1961. And since then, he and his colleagues have gone on to explore this hypothesis of set and setting in their scientific research from the early 1960s and then on. And they published a lot of works on this. His most famous being The Psychedelic Experience, a manual from the Tibetan Book of the Dead.
Oh, indeed. Well, I have a newer version right here.
You know, it's crazy to see it in its future form because back in my domain, this is like our Bible. Leary is regarded as like this guru, the second coming of Jesus or whatever. So he really enjoys the spotlight.
I would imagine so. Can you expand on the principles of this so-called Learian set and setting?
The values are related to enhancing one's experience by considering the elements within oneself and one's surroundings. So the elements of oneself are the set, our personality, our mood, our expectations, and the elements of one's surroundings are the conditions of setting, the physical environment, our current feelings, cultural influences, things like that. And they even break down set further. So according to their manual, there is long-range set, which refers to the personal history. So it's everything that makes you, the good, the bad, the ugly, all of the in-between. It's meant as a tool to gain insight into who you really are underneath the layers of societal expectations, filial obligations, the temptations and fear and ego, all of the depths of who you are.
Wow, that's so beautiful.
Yeah, definitely. But keep in mind that the psychedelic experiences is, in the words of Leary, a journey to new realms of consciousness. The scope and content of the experience is limitless, but its characteristic features are the transcendence of verbal concepts, of space-time dimensions, and of the ego or identity.
Wow, right on.
Yeah, and so the immediate set refers to our expectations during the experience itself. So whether they are intellectual, spiritual, religious, rebellious, medical, everything that we are trying to have in this moment right here during our psychedelic experience versus something that the psychedelic experience will continue on with us.
That sounds so wholesome. I wonder why it's not standard practice in all psychedelic therapy.
Well, it's interesting you call it therapy because in my domain, that's something that we aren't really, that's not really how we use it. Although there continues to be scientific exploration into how these compounds interact with our minds and bodies. And Molly, I actually want to give you a lot of credit because in my domain, psychotherapeutic investigations really started with MDMA in the 1970s. But as far as the psychedelic experience themselves, the experience is just that, journeys to new realms of consciousness.
Word. So the connection between psychedelic experiences and therapy are really fascinating. And I think we'll be able to explore that more with one of our other psychedelics who is joining us later. And before that, though, I'd like to switch gears a little bit. So we're learning so much about the influence Dr. Leary had within this domain. But can you describe how the good doctor was introduced to psychedelics in the first place?
Believe it or not, he read about it. There was this photo essay published in the May 1957 edition of Life magazine by R. Gordon Wasson.
Okay.
Wasson was an ethnomycologist and a banker who provided one of the first accounts of magic mushrooms, at least in the Western world. Wasson and his wife, Valentina, were unprecedentedly welcomed as outsiders to participate in a Mazatec sacred healing ritual involving magic mushrooms by the priestess of mushrooms herself, Maria Sabina.
Ah.
And following the session, Wasson stole spores from the mushroom and sent them off to Swiss chemist Albert Hofmann, who isolated the psychoactive compounds psilocybin and psilocin.
He stole it.
Yeah, so Wasson had shared this experience through the photo essay, which we later found out was based on deception and piracy, and not to mention the violation of privacy of ancestral knowledge. But that's a story for another day.
Yeah, I mean, don't worry. We can always use the phone to transcend you in some other time. We'd be happy to.
Yeah, and so the rest is history. In 1960, Dr. Leary traveled to Mexico and first tried magic mushrooms and had his psychedelic awakening. And within a few years, magic mushrooms were available on the streets, and Dr. Leary began his psychedelic projects at Harvard along with Dr. Metzner and Dr. Albert. They eventually moved their research elsewhere after Leary was fired from Harvard, and boom, the practice of set and setting made its introduction to academia and mainstream culture in 1964.
Wait, so you're saying Dr. Leary, one of the most notable thought leaders in psychedelics, he first read about this stuff as a magic mushroom ceremony, and he would never have even known about it. But this Wesson guy, he was disrespectful of that cultural knowledge, and then he went to Mexico to have his own experience.
Exactly, and as you said, he's one of the major representations of pivotal mind expanding psychedelic experiences and counterculture. But for the majority of my domain, we knew basically nothing of Maria Sabina or the indigenous roots of psychedelic knowledge. And quite frankly, the promise of transformative psychedelic experiences was a short-lived hype that probably damaged the movement. I mean, look at the Controlled Substances Act, the war on drugs, and how it impacted psychedelic use, especially in communities that weren't abusing these substances and arguably had way deeper understandings of these experiences and connections.
I agree. That's definitely an injustice to indigenous knowledge holders. And as we'll talk more about it in the show, the historiography of psychedelics as a whole, and I think this is the perfect time to call in Psych Relic from the indigenous psychedelic practices domain.
There is a world beyond ours, a world that is far away, nearby, and invisible. Hello.
Hello.
Well, that worked
Hi.
again. Excellent.
That's a beautiful quote. Whose words were those?
Those are the wise words of Maria Sabina, the priestess of mushrooms. Speaking of which, I'm so honored to introduce Jess, a psychedelic who will expand on our understanding of indigenous psychedelic practices. Welcome, Jess.
Thank you for having me here. It's truly a pleasure to be sharing with you the life of the most famous Mexican healer of all time, Maria Sabina. To our knowledge, Maria was born on July 22nd, 1894 in Huatla Jimenez, a town in Sierra Mazateca, located in Oaxaca. She first tried mushrooms at the age of 8 and has since served as a guide to people's journeys in the spiritual realm.
Wow, okay, 8 years old. So that must have been quite the experience. How did she happen across mushrooms in the first place?
She was about 6 or 7 years old when an uncle fell ill and her family called a town physician who utilized mushrooms to diagnose the illness.
So wait, he was sick, but he was still eating mushrooms?
Correct. The purpose of having a patient ingest mushrooms is to learn the origin of his condition so he can contribute to his own healing process.
Interesting. And so the practitioner as well would get involved with that taking of the mushrooms?
It is said that a Mazatec shaman guides through prayers and chants the one who has decided to realize the cause of his ills and to watch over the good development of the ritual.
Wow. And so Maria dedicated her life as a healer after that experience? She's certainly a remarkable person.
Maria is remarkable in so many ways beyond measure. She was the first healer to accept foreigners in her village and let them partake in the ceremony known as a velada. This allowed for many outsiders to want to engage in our rituals and visit Oaxaca. Amongst the first to participate in a mushroom velada was Gordon Watson in 1955.
We went into the Mazatec area, far from the highways, remote from Mexico City. There we found that rotten bagasse, as it's called, bagasso, covered with mushrooms. These mushrooms I didn't know, had never seen. They were the sacred mushrooms.
Oh, Watson, we heard about him earlier. Okay.
Yes, we just learned about that earlier as it influenced Dr. Timothy Leary.
Mm-hmm.
Can you go more into the consequences of Watson's involvement?
His article was the first popular media coverage of the existence of magic mushrooms and the first usage of the term magic mushroom. This led to a big interest in partaking in veladas, which brought a lot of people to come to Mexico, and the police did not like that. They actually thought that Maria was a drug dealer. This unwanted attention also messed with Mazatec social dynamics and it threatened our customs. So the people blamed Maria for this, and she was exiled, she was sent to jail, they burned her house down, and they killed her son.
Wow.
She was full of regret after allowing Watson into her village for and letting them know our way of life.
Dang, that's pretty awful to hear. I'm sorry that this attention and curiosity led to so much in her life within indigenous practices in general.
Thank you, I appreciate that.
So, to catch us back up, previously we learned about set and setting during the Leary era of psychedelics, which now we understand was influenced by Maria. Jess, can you talk about how this practice is integral to indigenous psychedelic experiences even before Leary coined this new concept to the Western world? Please share as much or as little as you can.
Yes, of course. I'll talk about our veladas, or what we call our ceremonies.
That sounds wonderful. Are there specific preparations?
Well, the velada is quite the event. Actually, it is done in a curandera's home. Maria always hosted her ceremonies in her home with an altar. There is prepping of the body before the ceremony, and it's advised that you fast beforehand. Sexual abstinence is usually recommended for several days before and after the ceremony, and pork tends to be avoided during this time.
Okay, so this is what would be the set of the velada, the personal set.
Yes, more or less. The ceremony would begin around 8 p.m. Everyone dresses in their best clothes, best outfits. Women wear hupulis or native regalia. Men wear classic white trousers tied around the waist with strings, and their best serapes around over their clean shirts. At this time, the music and religious displays to set the tone. The mushrooms, or los niños santos as we call them, are kept in a box to be respected. They are distributed in pairs to represent the idea of duality and the archetype of primordial couple. Powdered San Pedro tobacco may be used alongside the mushrooms, applied topically to the wrists and forearms by the curandera as a tonic for the body. The tobacco is believed to have magical or remedial qualities, as it is also used as an offering to the altar. These veladas are used to receive enlightenment from God, so we make ofrendas to them. At around p.m., we begin to clean the mushrooms. We recite prayers. Once ingested by the family and Maria, they begin their journey by taking out the candlelight. We use candlelight later in the ceremony, and the presence of candles is very important. Candle flames serve as a neutral and absorbing focal point as means of anchoring awareness in the present. But for now, everyone is left in the darkness to minimize distractions and focus in mind to ensure that visions are bright and clear.
So it sounds like this is transitioning to what would consider a setting. Is that correct?
Yes, you could think of it that way. This is why the whole experience is done with a family or group to promote communal support. There are mats on the ground if you wish to lay down, and for the children to sleep, usually near the altar.
An altar again. So there's a lot of importance around this altar? Is that what I'm hearing?
Yes, absolutely. Like I mentioned before, it is the focal point of the ceremony. It is used before and during the ceremony to set the tone for the velada. It gets your mind ready for the experience that you're about to partake in.
So, as a practitioner, how often would Maria partake in the consumption of Los Niños Santos?
It depends on if the community needed healing, but typically maybe once or twice a week.
Wow, multiple trips a week? I cannot imagine doing multiple trips a week. How many mushroom or grams does it take at a time?
Well, we count them in pairs, usually about 13 pairs, but I'm not sure how many grams that is. Maria chants during the velada to help guide our focal point to the traditional altar.
Thank you so much, Jess, for sharing that with us. We're truly honored to be graced with the life and legacy of Maria Sabina. She is indeed a priestess of not only my namesake, Silo, but of transformative inquiry and research.
Yes, and I know in my own domain, we were remiss in understanding the significance and influence of indigenous knowledge and science. And I'm hopeful that the domains beyond my time recognize the influence of indigenous knowledge, and that it's not antiquated at all, but rather imperative to our understanding of psychedelic history and future directions.
All right, Molly, this is a beautiful segue for our final guest. Let's go ahead and do what we do best on the show, Psychedelic Trips of Future Past.
Ooh, I love when we take trips to the future.
Mm-hmm.
Let's wait for it.
Hey, Lucy? Lucy?
Is that like Siri?
Yeah, it's kind of like Siri, but it's a lot more demanding.
and groovier, with a higher level of sophistication.
Hey, Lucy.
Sorry for my bluntness, but that's how I roll.
I know, Lucy. We all good now?
They are always like this. I love it.
One last quote from my new favorite book, In Limbo, by A.D. Oliwat. Shrooms are full of shit.
Whoa, family show here. But, all right, I know this is what you like, so... Lucy in the sky with diamonds. Lucy in the... Okay. Are you happy now?
Most pleased, dear friend. How may I assist you?
Always a trip. Please transcend our favorite psychedelic from the therapeutic psychedelic research domain.
Initiating transcendence. Begin your summon.
Psychedelics, no doubt, are a mirror.
And spectacular ones at that. Yet they are mirrors that magnify, undulate, and distort the objects reflected in them in often recurring patterns and forms. Ido Hardiksen.
Welcome, Kathy. Thank you for joining us on our trip through psychedelic set and setting.
Since you're the scientist, tell us about psychedelics in your domain. What's the experience or exposure like? And who stands out today as a thought leader within this domain?
Well, within our psychedelic experiences, we focus on therapeutic or biomedical purposes. And as far as thought leaders go, Ido Hardiksen, whose quote we just heard, he's a professor and researcher, and he has very compelling ideas.
Is there anything else that strikes you as thought-provoking about this Hardiksen fellow, Ido?
Well, he raises interesting questions. For example, might psychedelic effects actually be a cultural construct? I have a quote of his that's very good. I'll read it. So much of what's come to be accepted as psychedelic culture, values, ideas, social structures, stylistic choices, is predominantly the result of sociological tendencies and interpretations.
Interesting. So earlier we learned about how set and setting were understood in the 1960s through Western culture, and how they were practiced even before in indigenous ceremonies. So how does Hardiksen describe set and setting in the 21st century?
Well, according to Hardiksen, if we look back at the psychedelic culture of the 1960s, we might discover that many of the characteristics people assumed to be inherent to psychedelic experiences then were actually largely shaped by the cultural atmosphere of the time. The focus on set and setting back then was more or less on spiritual consciousness raising, wasn't it?
Yeah, there was a greater emphasis on personal transcendence, like connecting with higher energies and things like that.
Well, referring to historical methodology informs the best actions of today as we recognize we're part of a continuum. In my domain, the focus is similar because we've considered the internal and external factors in a given experience, but with more therapeutic intentions. I think a good way to compare them is the Leary and set and setting are personal guidelines for radical psychedelic experiences, while the modern adaptations of set and setting are being designed intentionally based on the participants' personal preferences.
So can you elaborate on adaptations for set in this case as it relates to Hardiksen?
In my domain, we define set as an interior subjective process related to intention, beliefs, mood, self-identity, cultural background, and prevailing life issues. Setting is about the exterior physical space or container for the psychedelic voyage, objectively designed with purpose, considering the place and the people involved. Hardiksen doesn't really elaborate on the indigenous set and setting, yet we know these are major influences on the work we do today.
Can you describe where we stand today with mindful methodologies of incorporating set and setting so we can create that positive experience for individuals if they want to have that psychedelic experience?
Sure. Attention to physical and emotional safety and comfort is really essential because external sensations drive our internal dialogue and processing. We adapt the environment to each participant's identity, maintaining a reverence for the psychedelic experience itself.
So you're saying that it's all this indigenous knowledge is being incorporated, and so we're out of that era, somewhat of just the personal psychedelics, and really kind of using everything we've learned to do that work.
Yeah.
So, what are your suggestions for creating safe and enriching spaces for psychedelic experiences?
Well, it's necessary to create a private environment that really minimizes feelings of vulnerability. And we use environmental modifiers to adapt the space to each person's personal preferences.
And how is this implemented to provide services to clients?
Well, in my domain, we use an intake process to determine each person's set. And then we use that in order to create the best setting possible for them.
Interesting. Is there a way that you can show us how you can develop a setting?
Absolutely. It just so happens I brought some footage with me today of how we design settings.
Silo, great classes.
Creating a safe, supportive environment is ultimately our goal. Our psychedelic voyagers need to feel secure within the spaces we have designed specifically for them. As a matter of fact, everyone could use having a space at home where they can go to for quiet time and contemplation. Let's consider various elements within the setting that can be personalized to each client. We call these environmental modifiers. Color. Preference for color is highly individualized based upon self-identity, culture, experience, natural affinity. The surrounding room and furnishings can be more subdued in color. And then by utilizing lighting and fabrics, we can bring in the color based on the client's preferences. And this can be changed during the process. Textiles. Color palettes preferred by our clients are easy to change out by switching the linens. We seek things like pillows and blankets. Our goal is to create an environment that is soft and stimulating to ease their comfort. Physical environment. We are seeking a low stimulus environment free from interruption. Consider things like temperature, airflow, aromatherapy. We can use essential oils or incense, which also leads to natural things like plants, flowers, a beautiful view out the window. All these things add to the experience. Don't forget water, drinks, snacks, things to stimulate the taste sensation. Artifacts. Various things in the room are very important. They may be things of significance to the participants, or they could be decorative or interactive, things to stimulate the mind during the process. Art and music. There's something about art and music that reaches to the depths of our souls and emotions. Music is so individualized based on people's tastes. Music brings an incredible richness to the experience, whether it's instrumental or drumming, perhaps percussion, nature sounds, or sometimes silence is what's best. Lighting. Lighting serves many purposes in the setting. It can be calming or stimulating. Consider brightness or dimness. Sometimes having patterns of light is very interesting, and sometimes no light is best. Settings that are created for biomedical or research applications are much more restricted because they have to function within specific parameters and regulations. The benefits of being a point of service provider is that you have much more freedom in creating the environment and the experiences for your clients. Imagine the possibilities for what we can create for our psychedelic travelers to give them enriching life experiences that can lead to self-actualization, perhaps even transcendence.
I'm really happy to see textiles, art, artifacts, and music incorporated into future settings. These elements are monumental in my domain.
Well, we're really moving forward with holistic approaches, and so much of that comes inspired by indigenous practice.
Thank you for sharing that footage, Kathy.
Interesting.
So Now we're in the present. We're past the psychedelic experience. The experience is over for the moment. So, and then what?
Beyond set and setting, there's another often overlooked part of the process, and that's support. It's people providing a safe, supportive environment to the psychedelic voyagers that's really an essential part of the process. And we may find out that the human element might actually be the most important thing of all.
Yeah, and that kind of sounds like what we do in my domain, although most of the support comes from a psychedelic guide and not necessarily like your family and friends. But it sounds like your domain has really expanded that immersive experience, which is a lot like the indigenous practices.
Yes, I agree. And I was just going to comment on how integral the community can be for sharing and processing psychedelic voyages.
I love the continuity between domains. It really warms my heart. To bring us down from our trip, Kathy, can you speak to what the future might have in store for setting, and support?
Well, absolutely. I'm sure we'll see more developments from the technology realm combined with psychedelics. For example, virtual reality applications, VirtuSphere, holodomes, augmented reality, VR communities, artificial intelligence therapists.
Shrink bots, okay. One thing we can be sure of is we are all on this journey together, shaping the understanding for all psychedelics of future past. So, good night, everyone. Thank you for co-hosting.
Thank you for having me.
And thank you all for joining us.
My pleasure.
In the words of Alan Watts, when you get the message, hang up the phone. Yeah.
Oh my God, we're done!
Yeah, within more or less acceptable time parameters.
Woo! That's rockstar.
Oh,